Every night for 6 years, Sebastian Reyes called a stranger he had never met. A woman whose voice he didn't know, whose face he couldn't picture, whose name he wouldn't learn until it destroyed him. This is the story of a war correspondent who's lost everything but a telephone line, and the woman on the other end who had been waiting for his call long before he ever dialed it. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that she already knew exactly who he was. The first time Sebastian called the number, he told himself it was an accident. It wasn't. Nothing about that night was an accident. Not really. Not the empty apartment. Not the bottle he hadn't opened. Not the way his hands had started shaking somewhere over the Atlantic and never quite stopped. He had been home 11 days. 11 days of silence so total it had a texture, a weight, like something he could press his palm against. He had covered 4 wars in 9 years. He had never once been afraid of the sound of gunfire, the way he was afraid of his own kitchen at 2 a.m. The card had been sitting in his wallet for months, slipped there by a medic in a forward operating base who hadn't asked permission. Grief and trauma support, 24 hours. He carried it through 3 more deployments, like a stone he refused to put down and refused to throw. He dialed before he decided to. The voice that answered was low, unhurried, entirely unsurprised to hear from him. "You've reached the line," she said. "You don't have to say anything yet." He said nothing for 11 minutes. She never once asked him to. Her name, she told him eventually, was Nadia. Not her full name. Hotline volunteers didn't give those, she explained. It was safer that way for everyone, but a name he could hold on to in the dark, and he found disturbingly that he wanted to. He called again the following week, then twice the week after. By the third month, he had stopped pretending to himself that this was about grief protocol or trauma response or any of the clinical words the intake forms used. It was about her voice and the particular quality of silence she allowed him to sit inside without flinching. Most people, Nadia told him once, want silence filled. You're the first one who's ever seemed to need it empty. Is that a diagnosis? It's an observation. I don't diagnose. I listen. That sounds worse somehow. She laughed at that. A short, surprised sound, like it had escaped before she'd approved it. And something in Sebastian's chest loosened for the first time since he'd stepped off the plane. He told her things he hadn't told his editor, hadn't told the therapist the network paid for, and he never went back to. Hadn't told the last woman he'd almost loved before the job made loving anyone feel like a luxury he couldn't insure. He told her about the sound a city makes right before it's shelled. Not silence, never silence, but a kind of held breath. Thousands of held breaths overlapping. He told her about the fixer he'd worked with in 3 different countries. A man who translated not just language, but fear, and who had texted him 1 week and gone quiet the next, and how Sebastian had learned the way you learn all the worst things now, from a headline instead of a phone call. He did not tell her about the soldier. Not that first year. Not the second. The soldier lived in a locked room in Sebastian's mind, and he had gotten very good in 9 years of doing this work. at walking past locked doors without breaking stride. But rooms like that don't stay quiet forever. They wait. They have patience Sebastian himself had long since run out of. Nadia, for her part, gave him almost nothing back, not because she was withholding, she said, but because the hotline wasn't about her. This isn't a friendship, she reminded him once, gently, when he'd asked what her days looked like, whether she had someone waiting for her at home. I'm not supposed to be a person to you. I'm supposed to be a place you can put things down. You're a very good place, he said, for someone who insists she isn't a person. She didn't answer that one, he noticed. He noticed everything about the shape of what she didn't say. The way you notice a doorway even when the door is closed. And some nights, lying awake in an apartment that had never once felt like home, he let himself wonder what she looked like, what her life held, whether the calm in her voice cost her something she never let him hear. He was wrong about that, though he wouldn't understand how wrong for a long time yet. What Sebastian didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, dialing a hotline number off a card he'd been given by a stranger in a war zone, was that Nadia had recognized his name the very first night he gave it. Not his voice, his name, Sebastian Reyes, war correspondent. The byline under a dispatch she had read so many times, the paper had gone soft at the folds. A dispatch about a checkpoint and a convoy and a young soldier who hadn't made it home. She had picked up the call anyway. She told herself that first night and every night after that it was coincidence, that the hotline routed calls at random, that Reyes was a common enough name, that grief made everyone sound the same in the dark. She told herself a great many things across those first months, and believed almost none of them, and answered the phone anyway when his number came up again and again, because some nights the wanting to know a person outweighs every good reason not to. You still there? Sebastian asked, into a silence that had gone on a beat too long. I'm here, Nadia said. I'm always here. The calls became a season unto themselves, one that ran alongside the actual seasons without ever quite matching them. Sebastian would come home from a rotation in one country's summer to find his own city buried in snow, and it was Nadia's voice, not the weather, that told him what time of year it really was. Steadier in winter, she said once, when the hotline's other lines went quiet and people needed her most. Thinner in the spring, for reasons she never explained, and he learned not to ask about twice. He started keeping a notebook, not for the network, not for a future dispatch. He had enough of those to last 3 lifetimes, filed and forgotten in a cloud server somewhere. This one he kept for nothing, which was the whole point of it. Small things. The exact word she'd used for a feeling he hadn't been able to name himself. The 3-second pause she left before saying anything she didn't want to say. The night she let a laugh through before she could stop it. And how he'd sat in the dark afterward, turning the sound over like a coin, trying to decide what it had cost her. You're doing the thing again, Nadia said to him one night, maybe 8 months in. What thing? Listening to me the way you'd listen to a source, like you're building a profile. He laughed, caught. Occupational hazard. It's not a compliment. It might be the closest thing I have to one, he said, and meant it, and heard the silence on her end go very still. The particular stillness of someone deciding whether to correct a thing that didn't need correcting. She didn't correct it. There were nights he didn't call, and those he came to understand were harder on him than the ones he did. Nights spent overseas in rooms with thin walls and worse company, filing copy under a deadline with his phone sitting dark and useless in his jacket pocket, 3 time zones away from a woman who wasn't supposed to be a person to him. He told himself the ache was about the silence, the way it had always been about the silence long before Nadia. He was lying to himself with less and less conviction each time. Once, from a hotel room that smelled of diesel and rain, he asked her outright, "Do you do this with everyone? Stay on this long?" A pause. The 3-second one. The one from his notebook. "No," she said finally. "Most calls end. People get better, or they stop needing the line, or they find someone real to talk to instead. That's supposed to be the goal. Getting people to a place where they don't need me anymore. And me. You're the exception I'm not supposed to make," she said, and something in her voice made it sound less like a confession than a warning. One he was already too far gone to heed. It was in the second year that the shape of it started to change. He noticed the questions she asked him grow more specific than the hotline volunteers' questions had any professional reason to be. Not just how are you sleeping, but which checkpoint, which convoy, which month. He noticed and told himself it was thoroughness. The mark of someone good at her work. He did not let himself follow the thought any further than that, because the alternative was a door he wasn't ready to knock on, and some part of him, the part that had survived 4 wars by knowing exactly which questions not to ask, understood that once he did, there would be no shutting it again. Nadia, he said one night, the words arriving before he'd fully decided to let them. Why does it matter to you, my work, the details? You ask like it means something to you specifically, not the job, you. The longest silence yet stretched between them, long enough that he checked the call was still connected. Because it does, she said at last, very quietly. But I can't tell you why. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have that doesn't end this. He should have pushed. Later, much later, he would understand that this was the night he could have pushed and hadn't. The fork in the road he'd walked past without recognizing it as a fork at all. Instead, he let it go, the way he let so many things go in those years, because the sound of her voice choosing to stay on the line with him mattered more in that moment than whatever truth she was choosing not to give him. Okay, he said. Not yet, then. Okay, she echoed, and he could hear, even through the static of an international line, something that sounded almost like relief, and underneath it, something that sounded almost like grief. It would be almost 2 years before he learned exactly what that meant. And by then, the wanting would already have become something neither of them could safely put down. By the third year, Sebastian had stopped pretending the calls were about coping. He still used the word to his editor when the subject came up at all, which wasn't often. Rena had learned not to ask what he did with himself between assignments. The way you learn not to ask a man why he still wears his wedding ring years after divorce. I have a support line I call, he'd told her once early on, and she'd nodded like that settled something, filed it under self-care, moved on. It was easier to let her believe that. The truth didn't fit into a sentence you could say out loud in a newsroom without it sounding like exactly what it was becoming. The calls had gotten longer. An hour, sometimes two. Nadia's shift ending and her staying on the line anyway, which he understood by now broke every rule the hotline had, though neither of them said so. They had stopped talking only about grief. They talked about books she'd read and he hadn't, about a bakery near his apartment that made the kind of bread his mother used to make, about the particular blue a sky turns in the hour before a ceasefire that never quite holds. He found himself narrating his life to her before he'd finished living it, composing the telling in his head while it was still happening, the way he used to compose dispatches, except this had no deadline and no editor and no reason to exist except that he wanted badly for her to know. You talk to me more than you talk to people who can see your face, she said once. Not quite a question. People who can see my face ask me to perform being fine. You don't. Maybe I'm just better at hiding that I want the same performance. Are you? A pause. No, she admitted. I don't think I've ever wanted you to perform anything. There was a stretch that year when he didn't call for 11 days. The longest silence between them since the first month. He was in a country whose name made his editor's voice tighten over the satellite phone. Embedded again. Sleeping in 3-hour intervals in a room with a door that didn't lock. He thought about Nadia more in those 11 days than he thought about his own safety, which frightened him more than the shelling did. When he finally called, his voice cracked on the first word, and she didn't ask why he'd been gone. She just said, I kept the line open, as though 11 days of silence were nothing at all to a woman who measured time the way she did. You don't have a schedule, he said. You can't have been waiting. I wasn't waiting, she said. I was hoping. Those aren't the same thing, and only one of them is allowed to disappoint me. It was in the 3rd year that he finally told her about the checkpoint. Not everything, not yet, but the shape of it, a convoy, a stretch of road he still saw with his eyes closed, a unit he'd been embedded with for 11 days, that felt by the end like the closest thing to a family he had left in the world. He told her about the particular guilt of surviving a story instead of just reporting it. The guilt reporters weren't supposed to have, and had anyway. The guilt of being the one who walks away with a byline while the other men don't walk away at all. There's a soldier, he said, and then stopped, the way he always stopped, right at the edge of the locked room. Nadia didn't push. She never pushed. It was, he'd come to realize, the single most disarming thing about her. This refusal to reach for the door he wasn't opening. You don't have to tell me his name, she said quietly. Not until you're ready. How did you know it was a name I was keeping from you? The silence that followed lasted long enough that Sebastian sat up in the dark, phone pressed hard against his ear. Some old reporter's instinct going taut in his chest. The instinct that had never once, in 9 years, been wrong about a silence meaning something. Educated guess, Nadia said finally. People who carry a soldier usually carry a name to go with him. You don't have to give it to me. I understand why it's heavy. Do you? It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite not one either. I've sat with a lot of grief, Sebastian. Some of it teaches you things. He let it go. He always let it go. And he would think later about how many times across those years he'd stood at the exact threshold of the truth and chosen every single time to step back from it rather than through it. Not out of fear of what she might say, but out of fear of what asking might cost him. The calls were the only unbroken thing in his life. He was not, he told himself, going to be the one who broke them. What he didn't see, what he had no frame to see, loving a voice the way he'd let himself love this one, was the toll the not telling was taking on the other end of the line. Nadia sat some nights with her hand pressed flat against her sternum long after the call ended, as if she could hold something in place by force alone. She had rules for herself, rules she'd built the very first week she recognized his name, off a byline gone soft at the folds in a drawer she didn't let herself open anymore. Never bring up the unit unprompted. Never ask about the road. Never, under any circumstance, say the dead man's name first. She had broken every other rule the hotline had for his sake. That one she kept. There was a photograph she still had, one she never mentioned and never threw away. A young man in uniform, laughing at something off camera. A photograph that had arrived in a manila envelope from an army she'd stopped being able to think of as anything but the machine that had taken him from her. Some nights, listening to Sebastian's voice unravel a version of that same road from the other direction. She would hold the photograph without looking at it, just to feel the weight of paper in her hand. Proof that the man in it had been real before he became a name in someone else's guilt. Can I ask you something? Sebastian said on a night in the 4th year, his voice rough with a fatigue that had nothing to do with the hour. You can ask anything. I don't promise to answer. Have we met before this? Before the card? Before the first call? Is there a version of this where I already knew you and I just don't remember? The pause this time was the longest one yet. Long enough that he thought, for a terrible second, that the line had dropped. Why would you ask that? Nadia said finally, and her voice had changed just slightly. into something he'd never heard from her before. Not the calm of a woman trained to hold other people's grief, but something rawer underneath it, something that sounded, for one unguarded second, almost like fear, because sometimes, he said slowly, you know things about how I'd feel before I've told you I feel them. And I keep telling myself that's just because you're good at your job. But I don't think that's it anymore. Silence received him. When she spoke again, the calm had come back into her voice, deliberate, reconstructed, a door pulled carefully shut. I think you're tired, she said. I think 4 years of this, of me, of the road, of not sleeping, is catching up to you, and it's making you look for patterns that aren't there. Is that true? Does it matter if it lets you sleep tonight? It wasn't an answer, he noticed. He noticed the way he noticed everything about her now. The shape of what she didn't say sitting louder in the room than anything she did. And some new, unwelcome instinct told him that the next time he asked that question, he might not like being told the truth nearly as much as he thought he would. Nadia, he said, before she could redirect him again. Before the moment could close over like water. Whatever it is, whenever you're ready to say it, I need you to know I'm not going anywhere. You say that now, she said, so quietly he almost missed it. Because you don't know what it costs. And then, before he could ask her what she meant, she told him it was late and that she had another call waiting. And the line went dead in his hand, the way it never had before. Not gently, not with her usual unhurried goodbye, but abruptly, like someone pulling a hand back from a flame a half-second before it burned. He sat with the dead line pressed to his ear for a long time after, listening to nothing, the way he imagined she must have listened to nothing on a night 4 years earlier, before either of them had a name for what this was becoming. And it did not occur to him, not that night, that the nothing he was hearing and the nothing she had once heard might be the exact same silence, arriving for two very different griefs, and meeting somehow in the middle of a phone line neither of them had ever meant to hold on to this long. There is a particular kind of loneliness reserved for people who have found the one place they can be honest, and then have to hang up the phone. Sebastian had learned it well over 4 years, but that night, after the line went dead, he learned a sharper version of it. The loneliness of realizing the honesty itself might have been one directional all along. That he had spent 4 years handing a stranger the unlocked rooms of himself, while she kept her own door, whatever was behind it, bolted shut. He didn't call again for 3 days. He told himself it was pride. It wasn't. Not entirely. Some older, more careful part of him needed the silence to think, to turn over every conversation from 4 years, like stones he'd never once looked underneath. The specific questions, the educated guesses that were never quite guesses, the fear in her voice when he'd asked if they'd met before. None of it on its own proved anything. All of it together formed a shape he didn't yet have language for. And some nights, the not knowing felt almost worse than whatever the knowing would eventually cost him. When he finally called again, she picked up on the first ring, which she never did, as if she'd been sitting with the phone in her hand for 3 days, waiting the way she'd once told him hoping and waiting weren't the same thing, and only one of them was allowed to disappoint her. "I thought you might not call again," she said. "I thought about it," he admitted. "I didn't like what not calling felt like, more than I don't like not knowing what you're keeping from me. That's not really a choice in my favor." "No," he agreed. "It's a choice in a favor of you specifically. Whatever you're not telling me, I've decided I'd rather have half of you honest than all of you performing certainty you don't feel. So, whenever you're ready." She was quiet long enough that he thought she might hang up again. Instead, she said something that would sit with him for the rest of that year, turned over and over, the way he'd once turned over the sound of her laugh. There's a version of this where I tell you everything tonight, and you never call this number again. I've run that version in my head more times than you would believe. I'm not ready to lose the other version yet. Is that selfish? Yes, Sebastian said gently. But I understand it. I've been selfish about you for 4 years. I don't think either of us gets to throw stones. She laughed then. The real one. The one that escaped before she could stop it. And for a while, that night, it was almost enough to make him forget the deadline, the fear in her voice. The door still bolted somewhere he couldn't see. Almost.